Yeah, I'm a senior lecturer in transport and planning at the University of the West of England. I've advised government departments, local authorities, and I was one of the expert speakers at the UK Climate Assembly last year. Now, I have helped the objectors in the past, although I haven't had any direct role in the preparation for this appeal, so I'm speaking in a personal capacity today. And I want to cover two main points. Briefly about surface access and modal share, and then to talk about the sixth carbon budget, the recently published Transport Decarbonisation Plan, and what those mean for this appeal. Now, the applicant writes of a stretching modal share target of 17.5% for public transport. Or to turn that another way round, 82.5% travelling by car and taxi compared to a current situation of 87%. Now, that target is only stretching in the sense that they might not meet it. If you look at the transport assessment and the sections where it talks about public transport improvements, you'll see that there's an awful lot of aspirational measures there, very little which the applicant can directly control. And of course, this is in an environment post-COVID where the whole future of public transport is looking uncertain. It's also worth noting that following the previous sort of expansion and government investment, there was a much larger, much more expensive improvement was made to the bus service serving the airport in 2017, which failed to produce the sort of substantial step change in modal shift which the airport is wanting. Bristol is the only airport of its size or larger in the UK which has no rail or light rail link. It has the highest modal share by private car by a long way, and you can actually see that in the applicant's own comparison of modal shares. That's document 3.4.02. If you look at figure 4.1, you'll see that they've shown it as a bar chart, possibly because they would be embarrassed to give you the figures. Now, the recent decarbonisation plan says, as priority number one, government's priority number one, quote, accelerating modal shift towards public transport and active travel, unquote. In the introduction, they explain that they want to, quote, reduce urban traffic overall. This expansion would clearly move us in the opposite direction. So moving on then to the sixth carbon budget, as we've already heard, that has now passed into law. It requires the UK to cut its carbon emissions by 63% between 2019 and the mid-2030s. And so that is an absolute constraint. It's not something which can be balanced against other considerations, such as, economic benefit or whatever. Now, the Committee on Climate Change advised the government that in order to reach that, as regards aviation, they present what they describe as a balanced pathway. And that concludes that to reach those targets, there must be no net expansion of UK airports. The government clearly has to then respond to those recommendations from the Climate Change Committee, which they have now done, sort of, in the recent decarbonisation plan and the Jet Zero consultation and the many documents that have been published alongside them. Now, I think there's one thing possibly we can all agree on, whatever our view and our stance on all this, is that if you have time to read all those documents, they are really not helpful. You know, if we had hoped for clarity in response to the Climate Change Committee and those legal targets, you won't really find it in those documents. They appear to be doing what governments of all kinds like to do, which is to dodge making difficult decisions and devolve them to other parties, including future governments. However, I believe that there is a clear implication from all of those documents for this appeal. The Jet Zero consultation says, quote, "We recognise that net zero 2050 must be achieved, and we must ensure that any growth in aviation is compatible with our emission reduction commitments." The government then sets an emissions reduction trajectory based on the Climate Change Committee's balanced pathway, which they call the high ambition scenario, which you'll see in more than one of these documents. Now, they say that they believe that this can be achieved without any direct constraint on aviation demand. Why are they saying this? Well, then you have to go to the scenarios in the evidence and analysis document. Now, the high ambition scenario is based on assumptions which they describe, the document itself describes as optimistic. For example, it depends on an annual increase in fuel efficiency of 2% compared to the 1.4%, which was assessed as likely by the Climate Change Committee. It's also worth noting that the only specific policy, demand policy, which the government is proposing, which is carbon pricing, they are expecting only to make a very small contribution to moderating the increase in demand. Now, they go on to say, quote, "There are scenarios which could achieve those legal targets without any direct constraint on demand. But, and this is probably my most important point, they do not show any evidence which suggests that those optimistic scenarios are likely to happen. They're not even claiming to have provided such evidence." If you then read the technology roadmap, which was published at the same time as all of those other documents, that's a sort of semi-independent report which they commissioned from Mott MacDonald consultants, you will see that that gives a rather more realistic assessment of what is or is not likely to happen in future with all of these sort of speculative technologies which they are that they want to promote and support. So that they don't believe, for example, unlike the government, they don't believe that domestic aviation will be able to fully decarbonise through technology by 2050, let alone 2040, which is what the government is now consulting on. Now, these policies, the government policies, then go on to say that they will keep everything, quote, under review. We all know what that means. Kicking the can down the road, knowing that future governments will have to take further action to keep aviation within those legal limits. Now, there is a footnote to the Jet Zero consultation which says, quote, that expansion of any airport must meet its climate change obligations. Look, it doesn't explain what those obligations are. It refers to two older documents that were published in 2018, neither of which really help you. Most pointedly, it does not refer to the 2013 aviation framework, presumably implying that events have passed on since then. So they are saying to local authorities, you must make your own judgments in a context of great uncertainty and without much help from us. Now, there is a legitimate element of local democracy in deciding planning applications, not just in setting the policy. That's why it's councillors rather than officers or planning inspectors who make those decisions. And providing the councillors are following their own policies and they're not violating national policies, it is not the role of a planning inquiry to supplant that democratic element. North Somerset's core strategy, policy CS23, says about airport applications that they must demonstrate the satisfactory resolution of environmental issues. And the text makes clear that climate change is one of those environmental issues. Clearly, from what we know today, clearly it is the most important of those environmental issues. The councillors decided, following the net zero legislation passing in 2019, but before the publication of the 6th carbon budget, that expansion of Bristol Airport was not compatible with the UK's climate obligation. And I'm sure during the course of this inquiry you will hear much evidence to say that that judgment, which they are entitled to make, was indeed a very reasonable one. I will just mention as one last point in relation to that, that if you look at the last published Department for Transport Aviation forecasts, all of the various scenarios for future growth, including some which were going to really bust even the old target, the pre-net zero target of 37 megatons a year, all of those targets are based on Bristol Airport showing a maximum of 10 million passenger movements per annum. So for those and for many other reasons, I believe this appeal should be rejected.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Dr. Melia. Yes, Mr. Humphreys.
Dr. Melia, we've got a climate change topic later in the inquiry, so I'm not going to ask you about the detail of those things, but there are a couple of points I want to just take up with you. On your university's website, you have a large and very attractive page seeking to attract international students to the university. And you've been very successful at that. I think you currently have about 16% of international students from around the world that attend the University of the West of England. How do you think they arrive in the UK?
I do not believe that universities, including my own university, should be seeking to expand their business model in that way. And I personally have always refused. I have stopped flying in 15 years ago and have always turned down all requests, for example, to present at conferences that would involve flying.
And what measures have you personally taken to discourage international students from attending the University of West of England?
That's not my job.
Oh, so it's a kind of job's worth thing, is it? Not your job, so not your responsibility.
Listen, I've been an expert witness in the past, and I know that bullying barristers is an occupational hazard. If you would like to, I'm not representing anyone today, so if you'd like to put a civil question to me, I will answer it.
That is a perfectly civil question. I asked you what measures you had taken, because of your stance, to discourage international students. Your answer, not my job.
My answer is that I have always refused to fly on university business. I also teach about this. I encourage students to take those issues involved. I am not involved in recruitment. So it's not my job in the same way that it's not your job.